So let's say language planning, struggle for self-determination, self-organization, academic contexts, like the Kurdish Institute, and this conference, of course. In addition, this comparative research program also has a political dimension. So none of us, I would argue, will be able to challenge the orthodoxy of Middle East studies as a field which is still kind of Arabo-centric, Turco-centric, Iranian-centric, unless the margins of the field, Jewish studies, Kurdish studies, Amazigh studies, Middle Eastern Christian studies, engage in both a critical dialogue and systematic attempts at coalition building wherever possible. So, how could this look like on the ground? I'll start with a few general introductions. I'll make the case for a dialogue, and then I'll move into a case study, which consists of how Jewish Israeli thinkers have studied Kurdish history to look at themselves, but also to understand the region and what they might learn from the Kurdish experience. Let me start with three research lines, which I would argue bring together these two fields of Kurdish studies and Jewish studies. The first one is shared history. So Jews and Kurds share a long history of close relations. And I would also argue that, if we look at the recent decade, they seem to share similar enemies. No one who witnessed the massacre of Hamas against Israeli civilians on October 7th, which I lived through in a bunker in Beersheba under rocket fire, could ignore the parallels between what was happening here to Jewish civilians, to what Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, did to Kurdish and Yazidi civilians. This insight should not blind us to the fate of Palestinian civilians, caught in the Gaza Strip between the terrorist violence of Hamas and Israel's harsh military response. Similar to Arab civilians who lived through Daesh over Mosul, many of them do not share the murderous vision of Hamas and clearly deserve our sympathy. And if I speak of such a shared history, statelessness and today's title, so Diaspora, in many ways this shared history of Jews and Kurds also extends to the Palestinians. In many ways, modern Kurdish nationalism has been split over the question, who should be the role model? Should it be the Israeli case, language revitalization, state-centered nation building, or should it be the Palestinian role model, nation building through revolutionary violence? And I think it's still, to me, a puzzling twist how in recent years, the PKK, at least officially, seems to have abandoned this Palestinian role model, only to move on to the non-state model theorized by Murray Bookchin, a Jewish diasporic anarchist. Second research line connecting our two fields is entangled memory. On a research trip to Iraqi Kurdistan last year, together with my research associate, Perez, we visited a number of Anfal museums, and I was personally puzzled and touched to see how similar they were in comparison to Holocaust memorial sites. So, if you enter these museums, the first tangible reminder of the Anfal horrors were literally piles of shoes, which belonged to the slaughter victims. As we found out, based on interviews, this was no coincidence. So the museum directors of these Anfal museums had actually organized a trip to Auschwitz to study how to commemorate a genocide and how to preserve the memory of the victims. This brings me to the third core research line connecting our two fields, mutual fascination. Throughout the tumultuous 20th century, Jews and Kurds have observed one another, they've studied one another. We have Joyce Blow with us, just think of Michael Chayet or Afra Benjo. They've studied one another, they've been drawn to one another, they have shared enemies, a long history of interaction, they have the diasporic setting, the context of statelessness, regional isolation. So wherever the various Kurdish movements stand on Israel and Palestine, I think this fascination deserves to be studied. I will now talk about one element of this, so Israeli Kurdophilia, the way how Israeli thinkers have been fascinated by the Kurdish experience. I'm currently also working on kind of the mirror image, namely Kurdish texts and Kurdish fascination for both Israel and Palestine. What do I mean by Kurdophilia? Perhaps the first way of looking at how people interact with the Kurds, and we heard about their criminalization in a German context, and this view that they're all terrorists, would be something that I would call Kurdophobia. So a form of racism and resentment towards the Kurds as a people, the Kurdish language, the Kurdish history. But at the same time, we also have this mirror image of Kurdophilia. So people who are fascinated by the Kurdish language, people are willing to fight and die for the Kurdish cause, especially among the internationalists and the PKK.